Hi, welcome to the Aruba OS 8.3 how-to video series. This is the 7th video in a 15 video series that covers the initial configuration and deployment of an Aruba OS 8.3 system. Now, this video specific today is going to cover the Mobility Master and give a brief tour over how you configure the Mobility Master, how configuration, inheritance, and the node hierarchy work, and point out some tips in how you deploy your configuration and key things to look out for. Now, when you look at the Mobility Master itself, it's really broken down into two key components. The first component is the Mobility Master itself, which is the configuration that manages all of the services that run on the Mobility Master. So these are things like AirMatch, UCC, how different elements of the Mobility Master and the system are handled. And then the other part is the managed network, and this is where the controllers and the access points live and where the configuration for those APs and controllers are maintained. Now, starting with the Mobility Master configuration elements, when you look at this, you'll see that there is a global Mobility Master that you can select, and then there are individual Mobility Masters underneath it. When we click on the Mobility Master itself, these are the global settings over the Mobility Master, or what you'll hear us call commonly the /mm. And where that comes from is when we log into a Mobility Master and we do a show configuration node hierarchy. What you see here is the MM, which is the Mobility Master config. This MM/mynode is the actual Mobility Master server itself. And the differentiation between these two is the MM side is where licensing and services are managed. The mynode component is where things like the Mobility Master IP address, SNMP settings, etc., that's where that information is saved. So think more device-specific Mobility Master config. This is more system Mobility Master configuration. Conversely, underneath that, we have the managed network itself. So these are the groups and folders and devices that exist that are going to be terminating access points and users and handling user traffic. Same situations applies. This managed network in the command line notional architecture is called the MD, or the managed devices. And then within MD, you can see there are different folders or groups. This MD/campus A and MD/campus B are both listed here, and then the devices that are within it. Now, in the command line, just to give you a brief tour, you can do things like change directory to MM, and that will put me in the Mobility Master Management node. Or I can do things like cd md/campus A, and that will put me into the node of campus A, or into that group. Now, if you lose track of where you're at, you can do some very Linux-esque commands like pwd, and that will tell you what node you're in. Also, some other things to be aware of if you want to peruse the command line. When you do a show run, that will give you, everyone kind of knows what show run means. But when you do a show run on the MM, regardless of what node you're in, that's going to be the running configuration of the Mobility Master itself. So if you're wanting to see the configuration of a group or a device, what you would actually run is you can do a show configuration effective. And what that does is it essentially builds what the running configuration is for all the devices that are in that folder. So all devices in that folder are going to have all of these elements of the configuration for the devices that are in there. You can also, however, do a show config, sorry, it blanked on me. There we go, sorry about that. It is show config committed. So when I do a show config committed, this is actually just giving me the elements in that node that are unique to that node. So everything in MD is kind of the global config, and when I look at the show configuration committed for campus A, you can see that there's a VLAN 200 and there's an AP group default, and that is the only difference between the effective config of campus A and the effective config of MD. I can also, whoops, that's not what I wanted. If I look at the node hierarchy, let's say I want to go into VMC A1, I can either do a cd into that device itself, and then from here I can do a show config committed, and then this is where you'll see things like IP addresses, VLAN, and interface assignments. So this is essentially what exists inside here. And so I will go back to my node. That will put me back into the Mobility Master. So I know that's a very brief tour, but just as if you start to play around inside the command line, that is a very brief explanation of what that looks like. Looking back in the GUI though, if we look at the Mobility Master, this is the services side. You can see I've got things inside the system, or sorry, inside the services for things like air match and different elements that exist at the MM. If I look at the device itself, I can start to do things like apply IP addresses and other information like that. If I look at the Mobility Master though, the most common thing that you're going to go to in this node is essentially the licensing tab. So this is where all the licenses are stored. If I wanted to create license pools, I could do so from here. I could essentially say, you know what, for Campus A, I want them to only have a set amount of licenses. You would enable or disable CPSec from here as well. If we look at the managed network itself though, what's interesting about the Mobility Master in AOS 8 is that in the past with AOS 6, we essentially had two main components of the configuration. You had an AP group that was assigned to controllers, and then you had different groups of configuration that were added into that AP group. So you would have an SSID profile, you would have a virtual AP profile. And while it was handy that you could kind of take and reuse a lot of those profile elements and put them in different AP groups and build your config, it also meant that you needed to go to each controller and each AP group if you needed to make a change. Starting in AOS 8, what we've actually moved to is more of an inheritance model of configuration. And so if I look at the top level of the managed network and I go, let's say, to the VLANs, anything that I create in the managed network is going to get pushed down to all the devices underneath it. Now, the reason why this is really beneficial is if I have a large enterprise deployment and I have, let's say, 20 controllers that are managed by the Mobility Master, and I want to create a global SSID that's used by my guests and my enterprise employees, I only have to create that WLAN at the top level. I don't have to create it inside each controller. I don't have to put it inside each AP group. I can actually just deploy it as a WLAN and apply it to all the devices. That makes doing things like changing that configuration at the global level a lot quicker because I only have one thing to change. So for example, if I wanted to create a WLAN, and we'll call this, I'll create two of them. I'll call this global guest. We'll make this a guest SSID. I'll hit next. Now you'll notice at the top level I don't have any VLANs defined, and that really is because Campus A and Campus B may have different VLAN structures or VLAN arrangements at each site. And I don't necessarily want to create all of those VLANs at the managed network level just because I don't want to push all those VLAN configurations down to those individual groups or devices. So for now I'll just leave this as VLAN 1, but when I go and show you what I'm going to do, this is where the real power in AOS 8 is. Instead of defining a VLAN itself, what I can actually do is give this a name, and we'll call this global guest. And then the VLAN ID for now I'll just say is 1. And so instead of assigning a VLAN ID number to an SSID, I can actually give it a name. And then so long as any VLAN that's in any other group uses that same VLAN name, it will use whatever unique VLAN ID that applies to each one of those sites. And so this makes things a lot quicker. Now I'm just going to pick a basic captive portal page that's just a terms of acceptance. And then this is going to create automatically this global guest logon profile that's going to be used for the users once they authenticate. So I'm done with that. I'm going to apply that config, and then I'll go back here. And the other way to create a WLAN, I can certainly go to Manage Network and go to Tasks, and then I can create a new WLAN, but the process is still the same. I will call this Global Enterprise. This is going to be an employee SSID. I'm going to create a new named VLAN called Global Enterprise. And that VLAN for here is just going to be 1. But I got to spell it right, don't I? Global Enterprise. Not global. Good night. Okay. I'm going to hit next. I'm going to make this, I don't have any radius servers defined here, and we're going to talk a little bit about radius servers for now. But what I'll do here is I'll just make this a PSK-based SSID. Hit next. I will give them the authenticated role that is kind of an any all, and hit finish. And I'm going to apply this config to my MM. Now, once I look inside each folder and I look at the WLANs, you'll see that I have my global guest and my global enterprise in each campus. And so if I need to go back and change anything about these SSIDs, I only have to do it here. I don't have to go and touch every single folder. Additionally, if you're looking at different elements and you click on one of those elements and you see this little blue exclamation point, what that's actually telling you is that this is a configuration element that was inherited from a node above it. And so if you want to know where this was inherited from, you can click on that little exclamation point and it tells you that this was created in Managed Network. And then from there, I can either click over here to go to it, or I can just click on it straight from that little notification window. Now, if I focus in on these SSIDs, and I want to create the connectivity for these SSIDs at these individual groups, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to go into Campus A, and I'm going to go to Interfaces, and I'll click on my VLANs, and you can see that I've got Global Guest as VLAN 1 and Global Enterprise as VLAN 1, but that's not really where I want them. I'm actually going to put them both in VLAN 200. Now there could be different VLANs that exist for each of these SSIDs at each site. Let's say Guest could be 201 and the Global Enterprise could be 200. But whatever I give it, the important thing to note is what I want to do is create a new VLAN and call this Global Guest, and then I will create the VLAN ID that applies to that Global Guest for this specific campus, which in this case is 200. I'm going to do the same thing for this guy here, where I'm going to create a Global Enterprise, and I'm going to stick him in VLAN 200 as well. Now you'll see that I have my two named VLANs, Global Guest and Global Enterprise, both at VLAN 200, which is what Campus A resides at. If I look at Campus B, I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'll do a Global Guest and assign that to VLAN 150, because that's where that campus lives. And then I'll do the same thing for this guy here. I will call him Global Enterprise and put 150 there. Now what's interesting with this config change is that my SSID is defined at the global level and set to use either the VLAN name Global Guest or Global Enterprise, but when I look at the two different campuses, they're actually using the named VLANs but different VLAN IDs. That is one aspect of what makes the Aruba OS 8 Mobility Master architecture incredibly powerful when you start to deploy large networks. Now this same process still applies for any other configuration element. If I wanted to create a specific role, I could create a role called Global Enterprise. And you can always see I've got my Global Guest logon that was created automatically. And then I can go back into my WLANs and I can assign that role to my enterprise. So instead of just using authenticated, what I could actually do is just go find my Global Enterprise role and hit submit. And once that configuration is pushed, I've essentially effected one config change across 4 different devices instead of having to go to each campus or to each device individually. The same thing works for things like radius servers. If I wanted to create a specific radius server, I could create, let's say I've created Global Radius Server 1, and then I could create a server group called Global Radius, and I just have to add that radius server to it, and then from there, there we go. From there, I've got my global radius group that, oops, I didn't do that right. I need to add that existing server. Submit. There we go. And then I'll push that change. And so now I have a radius server, in theory, that lives at the global level that can be used by any of these other devices. Now, additionally, I can, if I want to, go and create specific, like I'll just call this Campus A local. So now I'm going to have an SSID that exists only at Campus A. I'll go ahead and pick VLAN 200, or I could just go ahead and create another one called Campus A WLAN, and I'll give it the same VLAN ID. Again, I can reuse the same VLAN ID for multiple named VLANs. It's just the name is just a name. I'll go ahead and pick WPA Personal just because it's quicker to put it in. Actually, you know what? I've already got a radius server. Let's just go ahead and use it. So if I want to use this Global Radius Server 1, I'll go ahead and use that. Hit Next. I'll choose my authenticated role, which I can just call authenticated. It's totally fine. And hit Finish. And then I'll push this config out. Now the interesting thing to note is when I deploy a change to just Campus A, It's only going to apply to the two controllers that are in there, so you only see VMCA1 and VMCA2 get that configuration pushed to it. Now, when I look at Campus A WLANs, you'll see that I've got 3 SSIDs here, but in Campus B, I only have 2. And so if I were to look at an AP at Campus A, it would actually be broadcasting 3 SSIDs. There would be a guest, there would be a global enterprise, and then there would be a local Campus A SSID. And so understanding kind of what gets pushed where and how you make your configuration changes can really streamline how you manage a large enterprise network. Now, if you want unique SSIDs at each individual site, you're still going to be creating individualized VLANs at each campus, but the goal would always be to have as much of your common configuration elements rolled up to the top so that you're only making small individual changes to devices underneath it. So hopefully that gives you a fairly quick, digestible example of how to make configuration changes within Aruba OS 8 Mobility Master. If you have any questions or if something doesn't make sense, certainly reach out to some of the online resources like community.arubanetworks.com, or you can reach out to your local Aruba SE or partner. Thank you.